Well, good afternoon to many of you. Good morning to some, and welcome to all. With a special shout out to student assemblies from the Greater Essex County School Board and the York Catholic District Board, as well as other schools across the country, and of course, all attendees who are joining us today. I'm Anthony Wilson-Smith, the President and CEO of Historica Canada. Our Memory Project and the related Speakers Bureau are projects aimed at bringing Canadian military history to life through the words and especially the stories of veterans and serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces. We're going to do that in a few minutes. It's 78 years since the end of the Second World War, but in every single year since then, there's been at least one war somewhere in the world. And very often, members of our military have been called upon to go there to help keep the uneasy peace that's the only thing that comes after conflict. We're proud of our peacekeeping role as Canadians. Many people say that it's one of the things that really defines us in the most positive way in the world. Our military people who keep the peace go, by definition, to the darkest corners of the world in the most difficult times. It's hard, dangerous work. It's long stretches in places where passions still run high, and outsiders are viewed with about as much suspicion as enthusiasm. And in fact, 130 Canadians have given their lives while serving as peacekeepers. We have a lot of questions in advance from people, and you can also send in additional ones as we speak. There's too many to get to all, but a lot of them are on similar themes, which is very helpful. So you should, hopefully, most of you will see, who brought questions, will see yourselves reflected in there. This is the 75th anniversary of the first peacekeeping mission. So that's the focal point of our discussions. And today we have three panelists who have been very active in those missions. Not all, of course, but many of them. You have their biographies, so I'll just do a quick summary of some key points. Retired Colonel Tilo Morrison served 35 years in the military in places like Croatia, Haiti, Afghanistan, and Lebanon, and three of her children now serve in turn. Perry Metaxas arrived in Canada from Greece, joined the reserves at 16. He wanted to serve, among other things, with the airborne commandos, with intelligence, and in covert operations. He's completed missions in Lebanon, Bosnia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Macedonia, as well as additional service for the United Nations. And Tim Reid has served on 13 missions overall as both a military and in a civilian capacity in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia, with both Canada and directly on assignment with the United Nations. Just a couple of other quick points. In the next while, and to help guide some of your questions, we're not here to talk about policy or political decisions, because soldiers don't get that luxury. They serve whenever and wherever and however they're told. This is really about life on the ground, to give a sense of what it's like and to give you that direct feeling. That's where we're looking to go. Also, one kind of caveat from our end at Historica Canada, because our staff is spread across the country, glitches on a live webcast aren't a given, but they're all certainly a possibility, and apologies in advance if that happens. We're literally spread across a bunch of different provinces and making this happen. I think also should be evident on the screen, pour ceux et celles qui sont plus à l'aise en français, nous avons un service de traduction simultanée, so you should be helped by that. We're not going to ask all three panelists to answer every question, because that takes quite a while. And I think we'd rather get to a range of questions as much as possible. But this is a conversation, or aimed at being one informally. So as we talked with the panelists yesterday, each of you should feel free to jump in, even if a question is asked to somebody else, when you feel you have a good point to make. So Tim, I thought we'd start with you. I think a lot of people don't know that civilians also serve on peacekeeping missions. What's the distinction between, or what's the difference between doing that and serving in uniform, since you've done considerable amounts of both?
Yeah, thank you very much, Anthony. There's, obviously some huge differences in terms of often how you're hired. So, there are, when you're serving in the Canadian military, you're always seconded, and so you go through a lot of preparation back home in Canada. When you serve as a civilian, normally you're hired, not exclusively, but normally you're hired directly by the organization in the case of the UN. In the case of the OSCE, you are usually seconded. And civilians rarely get any sort of preparation whatsoever, though they often serve in exactly the same theaters. And in fact, many of my civilian missions have been more dangerous than when I went as a military, for a number of reasons. They were more dangerous areas. In the last decades, Canada has tended to shy away from sending our military and police to the more dangerous missions, and shied away when they do from sending them to the front lines. For example, I was initially supposed to go to the Democratic Republic of Congo as a military observer. That got delayed. I ended up going to Ethiopia and Eritrea instead. But then after that, went as a civilian, where I was working in a lot more specific things. So I started in dealing with armed groups as a political affairs officer, and then became a team leader for disarmament, demobilization, repatriation back to the surrounding countries of the armed groups. And often we just were out there, by ourselves with no support.
I would also imagine you're probably not allowed to carry weapons as a civilian.
Definitely not allowed to carry weapons as a civilian. Though one of my military missions as a military observer, normally you're not allowed to carry weapons as a military observer. So when I was in Ethiopia and Eritrea, we also were not allowed to carry weapons. Though down the road, where I was based in Sanapi, where the first Canadian Victoria Cross winner is buried, as a small aside, we had a Canadian company of RCRs, a Royal Canadian Regiment, and they were there with their weapons. We who had arrived before and stayed after did not have weapons.
Yeah, which is not a comforting feeling when you know many around you do. Tila, peacekeeping is never an easy thing, and sometimes I would imagine a lot harder for women in uniform, particularly in countries, including a number of those in which you've served, where women are viewed by the locals as less than equal. So can you talk about some of the specific challenges and situations you've been in, I, of course, in the military overall, but specifically as a woman and a woman in a senior role?
It's a very good question, Anthony. Certainly, I felt some challenges dealing with some nations. My early tour in Croatia, for example, there were other countries that were with us that do not view women on the same level. So certainly, you have to get back to basics, and basics means sometimes using rank, which is unfortunate when you're dealing with those situations. And you're there to do a job, and so that I would always reiterate that I'm here to do my job, you're here to do your job. So certainly my gender shouldn't play a role in that, and often they always just get over it and left their preconceptions behind once they saw us in action. I'd say it was the same in Afghanistan. Certainly dealing with the local population in Afghanistan, as we know, their view of women has always been probably one of the worst countries in the world in regards to women's rights. And certainly they would, try at times to, downgrade you because of your gender. And the advantage in Afghanistan is, of course, we get to carry a weapon. So it is a little bit more intimidating when you're talking to locals. But again, I would just come back and say, hey, look, I'm here to do a job, and my job and my role is this. And, you can help me do my job and make it better for you, or you can't, and it will just not go so well overall, like in the whole mission. So overall, they would get over it. And I found, like in a place like Afghanistan, most of them had a lot of respect for the Canadian military women. So in general, that was what we saw. Whereas at home, they might treat other women differently. They did have a lot of respect for us, and I don't understand the culture behind that. Honestly, I don't know. I know I talked to some of them. They said, "Well, you guys all seem very well educated and great leaders." And I would say back, "But your women are too. You just don't give them the chance." So there was some challenges there, but overall, I would say it went really, really well. You learned quickly to get over those challenges and do the job that you're there to do.
And thanks. And Perry, you come at things from a different way, of course. For one thing, serving in a commando regiment is kind of different in itself to begin with. I wonder if you talk about how you ended up there, but also you've worked in covert operations, you've received medals and commendations from the United States as well as from the Canadian military. I don't know to what extent you can talk about it, but are you able to give an idea of when people talk about covert ops, which is something which surfaces, of course, in a lot of movies and otherwise, what would that entail? Are you able to say some of the things that you did, or would you rather speak about it generally?
Yeah, I'll preface that by saying that when I became an intelligence officer, I specialized in human intelligence. That is to conduct information collection by using different human sources. And you do that mostly in a covert manner or a subdued manner. And you operate both in uniform and also in civilian clothing. In operations like Afghanistan or in Bosnia, the covert operations, they're very sensitive because not only have to deal with the local government, but also with the different human sources that you are handling. So it is a sensitive issue, but Canada has moved well ahead in doing human intelligence. Before it was more the British, our British counterparts, and also the Americans. But since then, we have taken a quite nice chunk of human intelligence to the forefront of our operations.
I worked around quite a bit as a journalist in different countries over the world in much safer conditions than you did. But one of the things that I discovered early, was when I was going into a place, I'd talk to the military attaches at the Canadian Embassy, who were always invariably spectacularly well briefed. And, for peacekeepers going into a country, I'm just wondering what kind of prep you get in advance about the cultures, the customs, also what to fear, what it's like on the ground, because you're in situations, I think, where very often you don't really know who your friends and enemies are. You may have people posing as friends who mean you no good whatsoever. So is it a long process together? Do they pull, how does that go? I'd like each of you actually to weigh in on that.
Yeah.
Start with you,
Yeah, I
Tim.
mean, go ahead, Teal.
Okay, no, I would just say it varies by mission, Anthony, honestly. So certainly earlier missions where we probably didn't realize the level of threat, like Croatia, our training was about 3 weeks. It did always include cultural awareness and a bit of a brief history on what's going on in the country and why we're there. However, by the time we got to Afghanistan, because of the roles that we were in, training was almost a year long. So it varies by mission. And even today, soldiers going into different operations, should they go on, like we still have one person in Cyprus, for example, that training for that mission is relatively short compared to those that are going to Latvia, for example.
And sure, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo what Tila has said. It really depended by mission. As a civilian, you normally get 0. Even when we were sent by the Canadian government to the OSCE, we got a little bit of intro. As with the election missions, we got a little bit of familiarization training when we got there. A lot of it you had to do personally. With the Canadian military, the 2 missions I did in uniform, the first one, Bosnia, we got a lot of preparation. The second one, Ethiopia and Eritrea, next to nothing. And then you kind of have to, I don't know whether the guys that came later on with the contingent got more training preparation specific to Ethiopia and Eritrea than we did. You had to, of course, have done your military observer course. But in terms of the actual country, we didn't get much. I actually sort of took the initiative myself to kind of try and create a country handbook draft, which I think they used for maybe the other guys that went later on. And I think it's a bit of a problem now that we have so few people on the ground these days in peacekeeping missions, the last years. And I think it's often a problem, when you send people to senior positions that haven't done a lot of peacekeeping and haven't got experience in the region. I think we saw that in Rwanda and some other places where it's very easy to be bamboozled, and you find people often, sort of accepting sort of the latest version that they got from their gardener or cook or driver or the local politicians and warlords who are kind of trying to spin them a story. And if you don't come in there with a good degree of preparation, particularly if you're in some kind of leadership role, you can easily get led astray.
Harry, let me move that question sideways a bit. You're trained to be a commando, which is really, to my mind at least, the cutting edge of operations going in, certainly in wartime. Peacekeeping, it seems to me, is quite different. In war, surely it's about sort of taking that hill, taking the flank, moving ahead. And I would imagine using your weapon whenever necessary, where it would seem to me that in peacekeeping, it's try to do everything possible to avoid using your weapon. Is that accurate? What would you say the distinction is between the two?
Well, as a soldier, you're trained, equipped to go in direct combat against an enemy. In the peacekeeping role, you are you are there to ensure that you protect the vulnerable population, and at the same time support that country to move to transition from war or conflict to peace, right? Now, peacekeeping, of course, it depends on different United Nations chapters or charter. It can be an article, chapter 6 or chapter 7. And chapter 7 is more coercive action taken by peacekeepers in order to fulfill the Security Council's mandate, vice the chapter 6, which is more of negotiation, mediation in order to achieve the end state. So they're two distinct issues. And yes, the Canadian Airborne Regiment did deploy to Somalia and they conducted peacekeeping operations. And of course, certain other things didn't go as well as expected. But the Airborne Regiment, the commandos, the 1, 2, and 3 commando, they was always in the forefront and always getting ready to conduct operations as directed by our political masters. And I just want to, if you don't mind, Tony, I'd just like to add something to what Tim said about the preparation of people deploying into operations. We have moved, I think, the yardstick quite well in advance, because back in the 1980s, and when I first deployed to Beirut, Lebanon during the Civil War, as a military observer, there was no preparation. I went up to Ottawa. I got administratively, I was supported, and there was no briefings on the culture, the medical issues, the situation, the intelligence briefings. There were none of that. Not only that occurred then, at the same time, they were deploying back to Canada. One day you're in a conflict zone, and the next day you're in a plane and come back here, and there's no connection between the two. Since then, though, I think we have moved very well forward in supporting by our troops deploying to operations, by the pre-deployment training and validation, and then on conclusion of those operations, we do have the decompression and bringing back our troops in a better state of mind, and back to Canada.
So that brings up two related questions, really, and we can all kind of jump, or you can all kind of jump in, hopefully, on this. One is, Attila, we're talking first about your experience as a woman in countries that are not always receptive, but there's also the bigger cultural question. It's not only that you're landing in places that have quite different cultures, and sometimes, of course, for women, again, particularly unwelcoming, but also for all of you, you're often working alongside soldiers and sharing peacekeeping with countries that, again, are quite different. I think of, we're not talking specifically about NATO, but I think, for example, of Turkey now being a member of NATO and perhaps working alongside where, that's quite a different world and quite a different way of looking at the world. How easy is it to mesh, and whoever wants to take, how easy is it, first of all, to mesh with, you find yourself alongside in a strange new situation for everybody, and you're also trying to figure out who's next to you.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that first. It comes back to why we're there, right? So all soldiers deploy under the same really mission set, whether it's under United Nations, whether it's under the NATO organization, we're all there for the same reason, same goals. And that's always what I use when encountering those situations of different cultures, and that class of cultures is to come back to why we're there. We're there to help people. We're there to bring peace to the world, stability, and to make the country we're in a better place. So if you keep coming back to those basics, then you can find that common ground between the differences and find the similarities and work forward to get the job done.
Tim, how different is it when you're, going in under the auspices of the UN as opposed to Canada?
Well, I mean, when you go in for the UN, you're responding only to the UN. And then you're much more independent from the Canadian government line. You're usually there, but not necessarily. But you're usually there for a much longer time. You get a much better chance to get to know the players and the different characters and the behaviors. So you see certain patterns of behavior, and so you have that sort of baggage that helps to understand things. Of course, it depends a lot what role you're playing. I mean, sometimes there's people who are purely working in administration, and it doesn't really make much of a difference to their strict job, whether they're working in New York or Brindisi or out in the field. And then whereas other people, you know, if you're dealing with armed groups on the front line as opposed to sort of just analyzing and writing reports back in New York, then that's a huge difference. So you're also, when you're deploying with Canada, well, it depends. If you're deploying like in the OSCE, where we're working like military observers, but we were civilians. So it was a mix of retired military police and other, you know, civilians, like other lawyers and others. Well, of course, so we didn't have quite the military discipline, though. And when deploying, particularly as a contingent, you're living, usually in the contingent base. You're, eating in the mess. Your leave schedule is much more organized, and there's sort of trips to a common base, particular sort of R&R spots and stuff like that. You don't have much of that when you're just there directly working for the UN as a civilian. So,
and
yeah.
Also within, when you're going in as a civilian, first of all, like, who do you report to? I mean, I don't mean the name, of course, but, do you have to pick up a phone to New York every day, or is there someone in place, or how does the structure go? And the second thing is, when you're going in as a civilian and you're working alongside peacekeepers who are in uniform, how do they look at you? And, do you sometimes have to say, hey, look, man, I've been there. Like, I have the uniform. I've done the time. I know how you're thinking.
Again, I think it depends a lot by situation. So, you have like very large missions. So like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, we were, in fact, we, the civilians, were more or less leading the mission because we were there for a long time. We were the ones dealing with the armed groups. Depends a lot on the contingents you have there. So, for a lot of the contingents that come there, particularly from certain developing countries, they have a very top-down approach. And so, you're only dealing with if the top guy is not proactive and wanting to get things done, then not much happens. Yes, you do have to often sort of say to some of them who have a bit of that attitude, look, I've been there. And usually after a while, they start to realize, who knows what they're doing and who doesn't. The other thing to realize is in a lot of these missions today, particularly as middle powers have sort of stepped away, for a lot of these countries, it's a money-making opportunity. So they get paid a lot more than what they pay their soldiers to send their troops to UN peacekeeping missions, often as much as 10, 15 times what it costs them to deploy someone. So the approach that they take when they arrive in the field is often different. Again, there's a lot of variations according to, which member state is sending the troops. Some are do train their troops better than others, have got more of a willingness to engage, and depending again on the commanders. So you've seen some, I'd say more so than with it sort of from a country like Canada, where yes, there will be differences, but you're more or less going to get a somewhat similar product, whether it's 2 battalion RCR or 3 battalion PPCLI or 1 battalion Bandu. Whereas with some of these contingents, just changing the leader, or when the leader is there or away, it just makes a huge difference as to how they perform.
And all of you, I think all of you, we'll start with you, Perry, on this. That I don't want to do, as I said, a lot of geopolitical stuff, but the fact is, of course, some of the faces of some of our friends have changed over the years, and some of the countries we used to be more friendly with or we're less friendly with now, and that changed it too. So, Perry, you've done this stuff. You did this stuff for a long time, and I think as recently as about 2017, you were still active, right? So for each of you, but starting with you, how has peacekeeping changed in form? Has it changed much over the years, the way you approach it and who you work with and what the kind of feel is like when you're out there?
I think it definitely has changed. Way back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, peacekeeping was more of looking down the different how those countries transited from conflict into peace. more of the ceasefire agreements that were in place. And that was more of the peacekeeping role that low country engaged in. But since then, it has evolved. And it has evolved in the sense of right now, in peacekeeping missions, they're multifunctional in the sense of the protection of civilians, the assisting in the disarmament and reintegration of combatants, protection of human rights, restoration of the rule of law. So they're multifunctional nowadays, and compared to once upon a time, they were more into the monitoring the ceasefire agreements and the mandates at the time. But by the same time, they become more complex in nature because of the different extra additional tasks that the peacekeeping missions have at hand.
Tila, did you notice big changes is the first question. The second question for each of you coming out of that is peacekeeping even the right expression to use? I know there's sometimes when it's been more about peacemaking, for example, when you're coming in and it's, the weapons are still pretty warm and, and feelings are still running really high. But let's start with the first on whether you've seen change or not.
Well, yes, Anthony, absolutely. If I go back to Croatia in 1993, Russian soldiers were one of the contributing nations to that peacekeeping mission. Of course, that's not the situation now in the world, and we find ourselves, soldiers in Latvia protecting NATO's eastern border there, and of course supporting Ukraine in their fight against Russia. So, the role has changed significantly over time. I think Tim is the one that mentioned that Canada doesn't get a lot involved in peacekeeping now. We have a few missions that we contribute a few more troops to, others ones or twos, and some not at all. And there's many contributing nations come from Asia and Africa. So that face of peacekeeping, as you would say, has totally changed. And like Perry said, the actual makeup of the missions had changed. So originally, peacekeeping, of course, was the idea started by Lester B. Pearson, and it was really to keep warring factions to the side once they agreed on peace. And so it was very much what we see still today in Cyprus, where you stood on a line and there's one, side on one and one side on the other, and as long as you're in the middle, they don't fight. Now, of course, it is very much a peacemaking in many incidences. It's more those Chapter 7 engagements from the United Nations, and it's more about protecting the population at large and trying to keep those people safe from the wars and the interfighting that's going on in these countries.
Tim, this is the first question, sure, maybe the first time you've been asked it, but do you make friends with others, soldiers from other places when you go in, or at least, UN compatriots? Do you have that shared experience of serving in places where most Canadians would never even dream to go in circumstances that are equally so? And those can be very, very challenging, but I think also very bonding for people on the ground. Do you stay in touch after, or do you just kind of move on to the next assignment?
I think.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah.
I mean, I certainly have quite a bit. Like all other relationships, like girls you went to university with, some people it's easier to keep in touch with, again, regardless of how good friends you were back on the mission. Yeah, it is a very intense experience. It's difficult sometimes, currently I have a little bit of difficulty. A very good Russian friend I serve with in Cambodia, and he's a lovely guy, but he's very sort of, Russian nationalist, and so it's a bit challenging to keep up relations these days. So yeah, you do very much so, because these are very intense experiences. So you tend to make strong bonds with people, both the Canadians I serve with and the people from other nations.
Perry, Tila?
Yeah, for sure. I must say, even today, after spending 11 years with the United Nations, I do keep in touch with a lot of other UN staff. Some of it have retired and some are still serving. And it's an experience that, it will rest with me for years to come, because being in places where there's conflict and hardship, those bonds are formed regardless of your nationality, because you're all working for the same aim, whether you're a civilian UN staff member or you're a military peacekeeper.
And what, when you meet people in a one-on-one environment, same kind of situation as today, and the subject is this, or it's coming up, do people, I mean, first of all, I think people often want to say, well, how was it? It's not something I think you enjoy, but do you say, yes, I do recommend it for something to do? When you're finished a mission, does it live on? We talk a lot about PTSD, and there's certainly grounds to have that, either yourselves or among, when you're, first of all, when you come back, does it take a long time to decompress? And do you ever really put that kind of service behind you? I see a no, Tila, so that puts you up first.
Yeah, sure. That's a difficult question, because again, it depends on the mission and what you've been faced with. Certainly, some tours, like I was in Haiti in the late 90s, and we saw some pretty horrific things then, even though it was a pure nation building type thing. Afghanistan, again, you saw horrific things, and I think those change you forever. In different ways. And each person, of course, gets changed differently. I look at it this way, that, we are there to bring peace. We're there to help other people. And sometimes, with certainly the reversal which happened in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, that hurt a lot of us that served in Afghanistan, because we lost a lot of soldiers to bring peace and stability to that country. So it's disheartening, I'll say, when you see those things happen. But on the other side, I looked at, Croatia, for example, is now a place that people travel to. It's a beautiful country, and they contributed soldiers to the mission in Afghanistan. So certainly, although we lost 6 soldiers on my roto in Croatia in the early 90s, it's, almost worth it. I mean, not that life is, losing life is ever a good thing, but sure. Certainly you saw how Croatia today is not what it was in the 90s. It's no longer at war. They can contribute troops internationally to peacekeeping and to NATO organizations. So you see value in that, and you appreciate the sacrifices that were made.
And Tila, you can certainly tell me, you just don't want to go there with this question, but it's interesting because I know that your children now serve. So I'm wondering if if you're comfortable just talking about what you would have said to them when they indicated that, did you say you better think about this? Did you say, yes, it's a noble calling?
I totally encouraged them. They went to Royal Military College, so hey, it was a free education like mom and dad did. But honestly, my eldest has already done 2 missions. He's done one to Latvia. He was the last rotation in Ukraine. He pulled the soldiers out of Ukraine just before the invasion. And I'm just filled with pride. Of course, like any mother, there's always a concern. But there was a concern when my husband deployed, and he would have concern when I deployed. But I know that they were doing something they enjoy, and they're there to help bring world peace. So you can't help but be proud of that and supportive. So.
And Perry, I don't know how old, I do know you came originally from Greece. So I don't know how old you were then, but you made a decision very early in life, at 16 or 17, to join the reserves in this country that was still, I guess, at that point, your second country, and do all that it takes being in the military. So what gave you that strong feeling right away?
Yeah, when I arrived in Canada, I was 11 years old, and I always wanted to join the military. That was a dream which I always had, and I fostered that dream. And when I finished university in Montreal, Concordia University, I joined the regular force. But prior to that, I spent 6 years or so with the Canadian Grenadier Guards in Montreal. But to me, it was always the serving Canada, facing the challenge, living the adventure, and that combination, it was one thing that made me join the military, both the reserves and then later on regular force, and I will never change that.
And Tim, what do you say similarly when I'm sure at various points somebody's come up, either friends or it might be family or just might be even casual acquaintances, saying my son, daughter, friend, something is thinking about joining the military. What do you say?
Well, it's I'm a bit torn on that. I mean, I love the military when I was in it, and I still love it. I think it's going through some challenging times. I think it's and speaking to other guys who have served, I know some left because they felt they weren't getting the support, and Canada is not doing as many missions as it used to do. And I think this is something which maybe our policymakers, trying not to get too much into policy, but I think this is something people fail to realize. You know, a lot of people, including myself, I mean, they join the military to do missions like this, you know, a lot of the time. I mean, maybe there are some who have other motivations, but this is certainly a big motivating factor. You know, I mean, if it's just to be a civilian in uniform, you could just be a civilian, and you know, but to really go out there and make this difference and see the world, you know, that's what gets people to join up, I think. So I think at any rate, it's a very good, even when I joined, it was towards the end of the Cold War, and Canada was not that engaged. I mean, we had, you know, a brigade in Germany, but it was calm. We had Cyprus and the Golan, but you know, I figured at least it would be very good training, and it really was. You know, it was a very formative experience for me. It taught me a lot about leadership and organization. But then we started to get very involved, and there were all these exciting things happening, which I wanted to be a part of. So, you know, it motivated me more. Like, I probably would have joined the regular force right away had we been in that situation. But at the time, it was relatively calm, so I just joined the reserves and then went over as a, you know, on Class C as a, you know, joining up full time for a certain period of time. And I didn't join the regular force at the time because I was at an age where, you know, the way it used to work was if you didn't sort of get in early in those days, you were kind of limited to your career progression. Now, I think it's changed since, especially with Afghanistan, but that was how it was back then. So I still think it's a very good experience, and I hope that people get a chance to go on interesting missions and learn and show what they can do.
So let's talk about that recognition factor or sort of general public view. For one thing, just by the way, we've just done a poll working with the Ipsos Corporation, with Ipsos pollsters on Canadians' views of the military in general, which is generally, by the way, very good news in terms of the respect given that the number of people, for example, planning to go to a cenotaph or otherwise observe things on Saturdays higher than it was pre-pandemic, when of course everything dropped off. Generally, people reflect a great, you know, 3 out of 4 people say they're going to make the effort, make an effort to wear a poppy, and there's a lot of other numbers. But you contrast our situation with the U.S., where, I don't mean to be flip, but it's almost a religious thing. You go to, you know, if you go to a game, there's jets flying overhead, and there's soldiers, and there's everything, and everything kind of stops. Do you feel that you know, when you've gone around, each of you in uniform, what's the reaction been like over the years? I don't even mean specific incidents, but is it one of respect? Is it one of indifference? Do people feel that they can speak differently to you? How does it go? Teela.
Yeah, sure. I say that's changed over time, actually. So, or in the early 90s, I don't think Canadians really, I wouldn't say they had a negative view of the military. They just saw us as only peacekeepers maybe, and didn't really know what our role was here at home. And if anything, you know, there's, due to public affairs, but also due to just things happening in the world between Afghanistan and all the missions we've done in Canada, you know, through floods and fires and everything else, ice storms, you name it. I think, you know, regular citizens are seeing the value that they have in the Canadian military, and have become much more open and respectful. Maybe it's a bit of that US influence in the media coming over and people thanking you for your service, which wouldn't have happened maybe 30 years ago. But it's a very positive to walk around in Canadian society and tell people you're a veteran, and then they're very thankful in general. So I think we're in a good set in Canada. I mean, we're not the US. We are different. We quietly, you know, will hold our flag up. We're not, you know, as in your face, maybe patriotic as some of them may be, but I think there is a lot of respect for our soldiers, and, you know, and it's a good thing.
Perry and Tim, do you find the same? Perry?
I find, yeah, a bit like what Teela is saying, I mean, especially coming from Quebec, it did, you know, when I first joined, there were still certain rules, like you weren't supposed to go out in your uniform And these were sort of things, I guess, had been instilled back during the October crisis. And I still remember, you know, having soldiers in the streets as there were bombs going off around where I live. And then, yeah, it did get, then it became more positive. And then occasionally you get these sort of, I think we've got a little bit of a tendency in Canada to sort of go on these wild swings. So, you know, we did all these peacekeeping missions in the 90s, which were very, you know, active and, you know, very positive. And then, you know, then there's one or two sort of scandals. And then suddenly it's like, oh my God, you know, the military is really bad and we have to totally, you know, reform it. And then, you know, something else comes along. Suddenly we're back to, you know, more respect for it. And then suddenly there's sort of this other kind of attitude that, oh, it's the military is in crisis. I think the reality is probably more nuanced. I think overall people have, as Tila said, have a very positive view, more so when we're actively out there. But then, you know, especially the media and the policymakers, sometimes they like to sort of wax and wane on the value of our soldiers and airmen and sailors.
So coming out of that, you know, one thing we've seen, with my white or gray hair, old enough to, you know, to remember growing up at a point where World War II veterans were hockey coaches or bank managers when I was a kid, were kind of people around the corner. And of course, those numbers are much smaller. There's still a very different view, I think, of World War II. Some of the situations in which you've gone into, each of you, are both very complex and also very hard for Canadians to understand at home. And I wonder if each of you have considered that, you know, thought about as you were going in, that you're putting your life on the line potentially in the very same way as soldiers in a global conflict. But is there the same level of recognition and respect? In other words, do you ever stop to think, this could be, you know, I'm putting everything at risk here, and do people even understand that? Perry?
First of all, both when I was in the military and also later on as a UN staff member, it was my personal decision to go into those situations. You know, being in the military and also as a UN staff member. As a matter of fact, when I was a UN staff member, I did volunteer to go out of the haphazard missions because it was the sense of trying to accomplish something successfully in order to improve the situation within that country. How does this reflect, though, and what do people think back in Canada, or you know, for people that go into those missions, right? It depends how well versed the Canadians are on different operations that's happening out there, and like I mentioned before, when I came back from Beirut, I mean, people had because I was a military observer and came back. Canada was not involved directly in the Middle East at the time. It was, you know, people were more interested talking about Tim Hortons and their coffee vice what was happening in Lebanon, in Beirut at the time. So I think it depends on education and people being aware of what's happening out there and how is Canada's involvement being a peacekeeping mission or in a NATO mission such as in Afghanistan or Bosnia.
And you know, it's only 3 of the 13 provinces and territories that teach Canadian history, period, never mind military history, as a very specific course in itself. All 150 years or going back thousands when we consider, of course, an Indigenous beginning. So there's demonstrably a lack of awareness. So, you know, do you feel sometimes after you come back from these things, like somebody says, well, where is that? Or what were you even doing there? Because you're alluding to that in Lebanon. Did you run into that, Tila?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would say coming back from, you know, my early tours, Croatia and Haiti, people kind of didn't even know what we're doing there. But, you know, Afghanistan was so front and center to most Canadians, and, you know, the deaths were on the news. We all had our hero picture taken in case we were the ones on the nightly news. So it does, I think, a little bit more in the minds of Canadians. I would tell the people listening that, you know, we often think of veterans, we think of World War II veterans, but There was 25 soldiers that fought in the two world wars. There were 40,000 of us that deployed in Afghanistan. And I don't know the numbers of all the peacekeeping missions, but it's probably quite high. So we just got to remember that, you know, veterans are everywhere. They're all walks of lives. You know, they're 1% of your population is veterans, right? There's 460,000 of us living in Canada that are veterans out of the 40 million. So, you know, we're everywhere that you can be. And so I think it's important for all Canadians to remember that, and remember that we were sent there by our government. It's our government that decided. And once we're there, we're all there for one reason. We all want world peace. I think if you talk to every soldier, we would all love to be out of a job because there's peace in the world. That's not the reality. The world is a nasty place. There's currently something like 32 conflicts going on in the world. So sometimes you need soldiers in these situations to protect, you know, children and to protect the innocent people. And so I just, you know, I think Canadians need to realize that you know, we were sent there because our government wanted us to go for whatever reason. The United Nations wanted us to go. In the case of Tim, if he's or Perry, if they're working under the UN, this is decisions of, you know, political leaders to send us in these locations to protect the people that are most vulnerable.
And I actually have a number, Teal, I can add to that, thanks to our ever diligent Historica Canada colleagues of mine, that there are more than 125,000 Canadians have served in peacekeeping missions since the beginning of 70. So that's
so it's more than
enormous
even
number.
Afghanistan, or
Yeah,
right?
that's all, yeah. And so that's, of course, several multiples over from World War I or World War II, which is not obviously to make that comparison, but to strengthen your point. Tim, is there any, for each of you, we've got a bit of time, but not all that much left. Are there any, I apologize again, this is a bit like saying, tell me your funniest joke on the spur of the moment, except it goes the other way. Are there specific moments or incidents or anecdotes for each of you that, you know, that kind of stand out? And it could be frightening. It could be a very happy one of sort of finding some brief moment of joy in a difficult situation. It could be the first time you put boots on the ground in a situation. It's, you know, just what might flash in your heads. And if there isn't anything on that, it's just a sneaky question by me, and you can curse me accordingly. Start with you, Tim.
Oh, so many moments. It's hard to narrow it down to one. I mean, there's
pluck a few then.
I mean, there's like the moment when, you know, I was in Cambodia, and this was, you know, following the coup in 1997, and then the previous government, now the opposition, was able to come back under international pressure, and there were sort of elections under very difficult circumstances held, and some questionable things happened, and so people were protesting, you know, the result in the capital, Phnom Penh. And literally, if you can ever imagine, everyone, say in a city of about 1 million people, out in the streets, and just, you didn't know where the protest started and ended. And then the government of the day which is still the government there under Prime Minister Hun Sen. Well, I think now his son is taking over. They were, you know, sending these guys down the streets with you know, one on driving a motorcycle, the other with an AK, you know, sort of firing above into the crowds, sending in, you know, riot police with batons, like, you know, thousands of them, just to, you know, beat on people. Then they bust in people from the countryside to go around beating people up. And this one time, in the middle of that, we were, you know, just observing all this in near the train station in Phnom Penh, and suddenly a couple of thousand of these riot police came, and the square just empties in minutes. And then suddenly I turn around, and there's, you know, sort of 6 monks and another civilian guy just standing by my car, you know, terrified. And so, you know, and this massive RSM figure from the riot police comes up and says, I'm going to beat the bejesus out of them, you know, if you don't get them out. So I'm, you know, taking them out, and things are being thrown at the vehicle. And, you know, we take them to our office in the hotel, which has also got, you know, Sam Rainsy, the opposition, one of the major opposition leaders, who's taken refuge in there. So that was a, you know, a very wild moment. There was a couple of times I was, you know, detained by armed groups in the Eastern Congo. There was, you know, once or twice we've given, you know, death threats in Eastern Ukraine. while they're with the OSCE mission from, these Russian mercenaries. So yeah, there's been a number of sort of strong moments like that through the years, which are fun to reflect back on.
More fun after the fact than during, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Perry, what about you?
I would say that a highlight in my career as a United Nations staff member was the 2 years I spent in Darfur in Sudan as a senior security advisor for the humanitarians, specifically international NGOs. And this is where I realized the division within the UN in the sense of between the humanitarian side of organizations such as UNICEF, UNHCR, international NGOs, and the actual peacekeepers. And although they all came under one umbrella and under the mission of UNAMID, they were still split, and each one was trying to run their own agendas. Basically, the humanitarians were asking support from the peacekeepers to give them protection and security, physical security, where they went into the deep field, and yet the peacekeepers on site, they were very reluctant to do so. So as a security advisor, I had to try to mend that, to bridge that between the humanitarians and the actual peacekeepers in order for humanitarian aid to be sent out to the field to the people that were in need. So that's quite indelible in my mind.
And Teal, I'm going to add one to yours. So again, in a much milder way, but as a reporter back in the day, I was in Haiti for a while, and I was in Afghanistan for a while in some challenging situations. But for me, I generally knew I'm going in for, I think, a maximum of 2 weeks. So every day I'd wake up and say, another couple of hours, I'm out of here, even if it got difficult. What's the longest deployment that you had? And as I asked the others, what particularly sticks in mind as a memory or memories?
So for me, they were all 6 months, with the exception of Lebanon, where we were there to evacuate 15,000 Canadians in 2006 when the Middle East was blowing up, kind of like it is now. So I'll say some of my more positive memories were, for example, in Haiti and Afghanistan, building schools for girls. We built lots of schools for girls in Afghanistan. We built some in Haiti as well. And just seeing little girls being able to go to school safely was just heartwarming, thinking that this could be the future. I mean, when education is in a country, then, when the people become educated, then they become a better country overall. So it was just heartwarming to see that. In Lebanon, seeing Canadians thanking me for saving them and to bringing them safely out of the country when it's in the middle of bombarding and in a war zone. Those are heartwarming times that make you very proud. But probably the most pride I had was I had I'll say, fortune of being the CHOC commander. So that's the flight commander, bringing back the body of Private Woodfield from Afghanistan to his mother. And it's very difficult to do. It's very emotional to do, but at the same time, it's very heartwarming to be able to, bring that individual back home on Canadian soil.
I cannot imagine how difficult. We're coming up just a couple of minutes, and of course the timing is perfect to ask. So 2 things for each of you. How will you spend Saturday personally, Remembrance Day, and particularly, of course, around 11 o'clock? And what would you say, what would you say is the best way to engage young people? We have a number of students, as I referred to at the beginning, in Remembrance Day, and in making them understand the significance, in general, why this really matters, why the past is so important, why this particular form of service is so important. So wherever that goes, I always seem, Tim, to start with you. No need to do any differently now.
Yeah, I'm going to try to make it to one of our local Remembrance Day parades out here where I am. It's there's a number of small monuments scattered around, and some of them there's often a service that's done, Remembrance Day service. I think you mentioned it before. It'd be nice if there was more history taught in Canadian schools, and that if that history would not just be about the explorers and the habitants and the coureurs de bois and that kind of stuff, but also particularly mention going forward in the 20th century and all the things that we've done, particularly our Canadian military. we used to have these, I don't know if it was Historica that did them, but it was this, these heritage moments.
That's us. Yep.
Yeah, some of them, to be honest, I found a little bit cheesy, but still they were great fun. And I think more of those and more, getting into some of the weeds of a lot of the sort of forgotten history. I mean, I served in the DR Congo for 4 years as a civilian with the UN, and was in Rwanda before that with the Human Rights Mission. But, there was a mission back in the 60s, ONU, which was I think the first to actually use force as a peacekeeping mission. And a lot of Canadians served in that mission. There was an Irish movie about the experience of particular battle the Irish fought in that mission. There's been other French movies about not particularly, they weren't in that mission, but when their participation around there when a city had been taken hostage. There's a lot of stuff that could be done. There's a lot of interesting stories out there, but we rarely hear about them, and I think we often tend to just sort of default to kind of what the Americans went through, which is important but very different usually from what our people have gone through.
Perry, we'll go to you next, but Tim, I will say to you that it's perfectly fine to say that about some of the minutes, but I will also, it's a great chance for me to point people to a number of minutes that we've done on Canadian military contribution at various times, World Wars I, II, some peacekeeping as well, particularly one we did in 2019 on the Canada's role in both the liberation of the Netherlands and also on D-Day, which had, as a point, both had about 8 million viewers in the first month. So there's an interested audience out there.
Well, you used to show them in before movies in the cinema, and that I haven't seen that for a long time.
That was when my hair was still dark and I wasn't working here. So.
Okay.
Harry, you're next. Where you'll spend that time, and what you would say to school children.
Right. Myself, I belong to the Kingston Police Community Volunteers, and on Remembrance Day, I'll be assisting along with the police to support the different commemorations in Kingston here. That's one. As far as the how do we promote that? I fully agree with Tim. I think it's to be more vocal and higher profile in our history and how throughout the years on the military side. And basically, I view Remembrance Day. It's not about us. It's not about the people that came back from missions. I think it's for the people that have fallen, the people that will never age, and the people that have come back from missions and they're not the same anymore due to physical or mental or psychological issues that occurred to them in the missions. And I always reflect on Remembrance Day, and more so the friends and comrades that have lost in military operations, and also comrades and friends have lost as a UN staff member in different missions.
The last word to you.
Awesome. So I'm very fortunate. I'll be in Washington, D.C. at the Canadian Embassy singing with the Canadian Military Wives Choir to commemorate Remembrance Day there. I actually leave in just a few minutes to start my drive. So I too will be reflecting on all those I lost on missions. And as fellow students that are listening, I would say, take time to learn. Our history makes us who we are. It's our identity. It's like learning about where you come from, maybe your cultural heritage. It's no different. It's our culture. It's our Canadian culture. So by learning our history, we learn who we are as Canadians, what our values are, what our policies are, and why we do what we do in the world.
That's a perfect note to go out on. So, of course, we're going to close. I'm going to first thank particularly the three of you, first for your service overall, of course, that brought you here today, also for agreeing to take part. I'm going to remind schools and other people watching that all three of our panelists, along with hundreds of others who serve now and otherwise or have served, are available through our Memory Project Speakers Bureau, either remotely or on occasion in person. and are even that much more effective in person when there isn't someone like me asking questions, and they can just go and really let things go through. So keep that in mind, and you can get in touch with us at Historica Canada to arrange that. I also, of course, want to thank everybody who has joined us today. And, you know, those schools that have come in when we talk about issues with Canadian history are doing a perfect job of illustrating firsthand, hands-on interest in this particular area and in Canadian history overall. So when we discuss an issue that needs to be fixed, I'm very pleased to say that none of you are among them, as well as others who have joined and indicating their interest again. So we will close on that. Thank you again to everybody particularly, and to you three especially. Over and out.
Real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry.